Hello and welcome back to my channel. My name is SewRena, and in today's video we're going to be sewing a suit. This is a suit that I've made before but off camera, and this time I want to make it so much better than the first time, and I feel like I am equipped with the knowledge as well as the materials to make it better than the first time. Today's video is sponsored by SewRena on Etsy. It is my very own Etsy shop that I occasionally throw up little accessories and merch and things of that nature. And then I use all of the proceeds to put back into my content. And the material that I'm using today, I purchased using proceeds from a t-shirt sale that I made a couple years ago. So if you'd like to support this channel any further, if you'd like to buy merch, head over to Etsy at SewRena, and I'll leave the links for that below. Thank you guys so much for all of your support. Now let's get into it. For today's pattern, we're using McCalls 4649. It's in a size 10, bust 31, and this was issued in 1958. Here is the back with the fabric requirements and the pattern pieces. Today I'll be making the entire suit, so that includes the dress and the jacket. For today's fabric, I will be using a mini houndstooth print. It's kind of like a tweed suiting material, and there is a lot of drape on this fabric. I'm starting out with the jacket because I plan on spending the most time on this piece, and I'm cutting each pattern piece on a single layer of fabric so that way I can make sure that all of my pattern matches at all of the seams. To give my jacket a nice tailored structure, I am interlining each of my pieces with some cotton twill for strength. As usual on my channel, I am using what I already have on hand, but you can also interline with a wool felt, a stiffened cotton muslin, or even some hair canvas if you have it on hand. This fabric does have a lot of drape, but if you have something heavier like the wool that I made in my rust colored suit, you won't need to add this much stability to your fabric. It all depends on what it is that you have on hand and plan on working with. Moving on to the lapel facings of this project, I used what little hair canvas I had left, as well as some cotton twill to line this. This part is really important on this project, so you don't want to skip making it nice and stiff so that way the collar rolls and lays nicely on the jacket. While prepping all of the pieces, make sure that you mark the center front line on the jacket front pieces. I went ahead and marked the wrong side with chalk, and then I go in as added measure to use a basting stitch to add another line on there for the front side. This will help as a guide to make sure that you have a nice straight placement for your bound buttonhole as well as your mock button, since it's a double-breasted style. You'll want to put in a bound buttonhole now before putting the jacket together. Otherwise, if you're doing a standard worked buttonhole, then you can put that in at the very end. This jacket design features a princess seam, so I am now doing some easing stitches to help ease that curve into the jacket. You want to take your time with doing this for two reasons. One, you want a smooth application, but also you want to make sure that it all lines up because I do have a patterned fabric. As you can tell, this is already going to be a very time-consuming project, so I think it's worth the extra time to make sure that the little details are pulled together. So I repeat this process on both the right and the left side front of the jackets, but then also the back also has the princess seam, so you're going to want to do this 4 times. So take your time and get it right, and this is what they look like. Everything lines up. I'm very happy with it. I press all of my seams open, and now it's time to attach the shoulder seams. At this point, it's very obvious that I'm working with scrap canvas. In fact, I thought I was all out, and it wasn't until I was cleaning up my sewing room that I found random bits and pieces of hair canvas and decided to go ahead and use it all up in this project. All of the prep work is done, and it's finally time to start assembling. And so this part is relatively quick. I am starting by sewing up the shoulder seams, and then I move on to the side seams. Usually I do this last, but in this case, they need to be sewn up first before I put this sleeve in. So that's what I am doing here. Now this is a SewRena you know better, so do better portion of the video. I knew that this under collar that I'm about to stitch on should have been cut on the bias, but I didn't want to use up the fabric, so I thought, you know what? I am just going to do it on the straight of grain. It's not going to be a big deal. Who cares? Well, I care. because it doesn't lay properly. I already knew this. I don't know why I thought this time would be any different, especially on such a large, wide collar. So I ended up taking this apart and cutting it properly. And in the next clip, you will see it sitting nicely on the dress form as it should have. And this is where we are so far. Look how beautiful it already looks. Look at how it's laying. It's rolled over nicely. And I'm very happy with what I was able to accomplish, not only with the materials that I had on hand, but this was also done within the same day from start to this point. If you haven't already and you're enjoying yourself here, please consider liking the video as well as subscribing to my channel. Also, leave me a little comment down below. It'll really help boost this video through the algorithm. Let me know, how long have you been sewing, and do you still try and ignore your better judgment like I did? I look forward to reading through your responses. Also, I think it'll be really fun for beginners to see that we still do make mistakes that are easily avoidable because we know better. Now I'm working on the facing. One of the most important parts of this jacket is making sure that you get this facing properly, and the way to do that is to make sure that you transfer all of the markings from the pattern accurately onto the facing. Because the collar is so wide, you can see inside, so if you don't get a smooth application, it will be very wrinkly around the neck. That's how the first one that I made turned out, and it was something that I kept seeing, like it drew my eyes to the wrinkles. Now for the sleeve, I interlined with some wool felt because I didn't want to use up any more of my cotton twill, so I used some felt to give the sleeves some structure. This is a two-part sleeve, so once it's attached, then I ease it on to the main jacket. So I am doing the finishing touches, the boring bits, so sewing the lining in, but first I have to put the shoulder pads on. And I showed you in my last suit video how I make my shoulder pads, and I also linked a diagram on how you can make it yourself as well. So I have one shoulder pad in over here, and this one does not have shoulder pads, and you can see the difference. So we're gonna make another one for over here. So it keeps everything just nice and straight and leveled instead of that slope down. A lot of patterns say that shoulder pads are optional, and while technically they are, it's not something that I would ever skip out on now because I think it adds so much to my work. So if you are interested in making your own custom shoulder pads, check out the diagram that I have for free over on my Ko-fi, and if you are a patron on Patreon, then you can also check that out over there as well. In the cards above, I will also link the suit video where I show you how I make them. The lining is put together very similar to how the outer portion of the jacket is put together. So I did that off screen. I used some scrap taffeta that I've had for quite some time, and now I am sewing the lining down by hand. One thing that really helps me get the lining in nice and smooth is to put the jacket on my dress form inside out. So I hope that tip helps. Now that the jacket is pretty much complete, it's time to move on to the bodice. And so I cut everything out on a single layer like I had mentioned earlier because I do want to try and get everything to line up as much as possible. I mark the darts and I get them prepared to go on the sewing machine. I also recommend that you go ahead and add stay stitching, which is a straight line of stitching within the seam allowance to help your armholes, necklines, waistline from stretching out as you work with the material. Then I take everything over to the machine and start sewing in all of the darts. I did make this entire suit before, so what I learned from the first time that I made this suit is that because of the 1960s-ish style, it's kind of like a bubble waist, sort of. It's very, very tight in the waist, but it still has an underarm zip. So I couldn't really adjust the pattern too much if I wanted to be able to still pull it over my head, even though it was extremely tight. So what I did do was I didn't do French seams for this project. Instead, I used my serger so that way in the future, if I need to let it out, that I still had a little bit of seam allowance to work with because I put so much work into this suit. I couldn't imagine there coming a time in the near future where I wouldn't be able to wear the entire thing. Another option would have been to move the zipper to the back, but the center back does not have a seam on the skirt. So I would have had to create another seam, and the center front already has a seam. So I figured it just would be too much because it would turn it into like a 4-gauze skirt. And that feels like a lot on a pencil skirt. I really like what I was able to accomplish with the jacket, especially after taking the extra time to stabilize and interline it. Well, then working with this fabric for the dress, I didn't like it so much. Like I said before, it's kind of like a tweed. So the cotton or whatever it is made out of is woven together. So it frays really bad. And it also is so susceptible for gathering. I did use a finer needle and I reduced my tension. But even still, I was still fighting with the fabric really wanting to kind of gather. I think in the future, what I would do is interline the entire dress as well, but go with a very thin interlining, very similar to the taffeta that I used to line the jacket. I would just use that as interlining to help stabilize the dress enough, but not so much so that it looks hard and rigid. Now I am sewing down the all-in-one facing. I did stabilize this with some interfacing. I don't think it was necessary for the pattern, but because this was such a drapey fabric, I felt like the neckline needed some stability. Then I go in and understitch the neckline and the underarms, because if you're going to have an exposed curve like that, then you want to make sure that your facing or lining does not roll forward to the front, because that will make for a very messy finish. Once the facing is sewn on and understitched, it's time to close up the bodice at the shoulder seams. So I go ahead and put those right side together and sew just the outer bodice, and then I go in and stitch the lining or the facing by hand on the underside. And now it's time to move on to the skirt. The skirt is a little different than most skirts. It does not utilize darts for shaping the waist. Instead, they use gathers for that little puff or pucker. So I sew the center front seam of the skirt and set it aside before moving on to the gathering. Before I can do the gathering at the waist, I need to finish up the bodice a little, and there is some top stitching on the bodice. So you want to do a 1/2 inch wide top stitch on the top and the bottom of the bodice. So we're starting with the top first, and I am using my quilter to help me keep that 1/2 inch top stitch, because the guide is completely covered by the bodice. Once that's done, I go ahead and start gathering up the waist of the skirt. I add interfacing to the zipper opening so that way it doesn't stretch out when I apply my zipper, and the dress is nearly done. I was really close to not making the dress on this because it's not one of my favorites. The only thing I really like about this dress is the midriff, because that's my favorite style of dress. So I bet you're wondering, why did I make it anyway? Well, because of the wide neckline of the jacket, I knew that I was going to need something with the similar neckline of the dress to go underneath it. And I didn't want to be bothered with trying to figure out a blouse that may or may not match or clash with it. So ultimately, I felt like the dress would be the best thing to be underneath it. But the dress in general is not something I would ever wear on its own. I just felt like the dress was the best accompaniment for the jacket, which is why I moved forward with the full design a second time. And I can't imagine wearing this suit without the dress anyway, so it just makes sense. Thank you so much for sticking through to the end. I truly appreciate it. It means the world to me. If you haven't already, like and subscribe. Also, if you would like to support this channel any further, you can leave me a virtual tip over on Ko-fi or become a bobbin over on Patreon for extra content and sneak peeks of upcoming projects. Special thanks to my bobbins and anyone who's ever purchased merch or anything from the SewRena Etsy store. Thanks to you, you've made projects like these possible, and I really appreciate it. Thank you guys so much. I hope you have a safe and wonderful rest of your day. And until the next one, bye.